German history tried to erase some of the most disturbing things that soldiers began to do the moment they realized Nazi Germany was finished. Imagine being completely surrounded by more than 1 million bloodthirsty soldiers, constant bombardments and gunfire tearing to rubbles the buildings around you, but your commanders force you to keep fighting a battle you already know is lost. In that moment of exhaustion and hopelessness, tonight we're ranking the weirdest things German soldiers did, not to judge them, but to show what fear can turn a human into when escape no longer exists. In the final hours of Nazi Germany, the lowest card on the table wasn't made of soldiers. It was made up of indoctrinated children and the desperate working class without any battle experience. The furious Red Army encircled the city as they advanced towards the bunker of Hitler, according to Stalin's instructions. But at that time, Germany didn't run out of weapons. It ran out of people willing to die, so in order to defend the city regardless, teenage boys, some as young as 12, from the Hitler Youth were pulled out of schools and shelters and handed weapons they barely understood. Some were given single-shot rifles, while others were ordered to stop Soviet tanks with handheld explosives that required them to stand dangerously close, so as to avoid missing the target. That meant standing still while steel approached, and in this process, many innocent were killed, and those who survived were captured in shock, unable to explain why they were still fighting when defeat was obvious. But here is what makes this, oddly, even more disturbing. Eyewitnesses describe boys still repeating slogans about victory, even when the artillery shook the streets apart. Yet even here, exceptions existed. Joseph Ratzinger, drafted into the Hitler Youth at 14, survived the chaos of Berlin, never agreeing with the regime. He would later rise to become Pope Benedict XVI. However, higher up the ladder, fear looked different. Because by this stage, not only had most regular German soldiers admitted the war was lost, but by now, fear had split in two directions. These were the same soldiers who had been ordered to force civilians and even children into the fight. They also knew the truth. Desertion from the Wehrmacht was punishable by death, so they were trapped between the rage of the advancing Soviets and the certainty of execution if they retreated. And so, in desperation, some tore insignia from their uniforms and tried to disappear into civilian crowds. Others burned documents, medals, and photographs, anything that could identify them as soldiers when the war was finally over. But this was only the beginning. The constant sound of bombardment, the rapid enemy advance, and the fanatical orders still coming from above pushed many into paranoia, so some of these soldiers began marrying in shattered, bombed-out churches as if clinging to one last proof they had existed. Others drank industrial alcohol, burning their throats, numbing fear in any way they could. Others went as far as shaving bald and even disguising as nurses, just as long they could successfully escape from the enemy and from their own side. But to understand what happened next, we need to think beyond fear. Because for the Waffen-SS, survival was never the goal. The stage was set for the fanatics. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were ruthless, die-hard men organized into death squads, trained not just to fight, but to annihilate. Earlier in the war, these were the same faces that followed the Wehrmacht into occupied Poland and Eastern Europe, enforcing the so-called final solution. Erecting death camps and shooting over 1 million Jews into pits they were forced to dig. So when these same units saw Soviet tanks rolling into Germany, into the motherland, shit was about to go down. And it only gets disturbing.
Spree that dwarfs anything before or since.
There are moments in history that repeat themselves. Moments inside a human being when belief becomes more important than reality. Hitler wasn't powerful because he was a great politician. He was powerful because he understood something far darker. And this is where most people get it wrong. You see, Hitler did not rise through strength. He rose through belief. In a nation shattered after World War I, rejected, humiliated, and defeated, he understood something most politicians miss. that people did not crave prosperity. They craved an explanation that would give them validation. They needed enemies, someone to obey, someone to follow, someone to stand above them, and someone beneath them. The politicians in his days could not inspire this, and once he discovered that, his ideas were sharpened into weapons, delivered through short, repeated speeches, simple enough to remember, yet strong enough to shape an army of elites, men who would burn the world before they watched their belief die in the hands of other men. It's 24 hours after Hitler shot himself in his bunker. At this level, fear no longer bred obedience. It became devotion to annihilation. Waffen-SS units, tank crews, and ideological zealots fought battles that generals called impossible. Counterattacks launched into the encroaching Soviet lines were pure suicide. Desertion was punished immediately. Executions carried out as the city itself disintegrated. Bodies were burned, records erased, orders followed with absolute loyalty, even when the point of the orders had vanished. But this was all the vision that the Nazi leader had concluded in the events of his collapse. And that vision had metastasized, no longer confined to one man, but embodied in the elite. History says this is where the behavior becomes surgical, because elite snipers refused to surrender, continuing to kill from ruins long after their units had ceased to exist. U-boat commanders scuttled their own submarines, sending them to the ocean floor rather than letting them be captured. False identities were prepared, and some vanished so completely they wouldn't be identified for decades, if ever. And finally, fear reached the top, where power realized it could not survive itself. Hitler and his inner circle. You have probably seen this last image of Nazi Germany, the Soviets raising their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. But whether you learned this moment in school or think you already understand how it ended, I doubt you've ever heard what happened just before it all collapsed. On 23rd April 1945, with Berlin completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, and severed from the rest of Germany, the craziest political twist in history was about to unfold. Hermann Göring was not in the bunker. He was in Berchtesgaden. That day, Göring sent Adolf Hitler an unusually careful and dangerous telegram. It reminded Hitler of a 1939 decree. If Hitler became incapacitated or cut off from command, Göring was to assume leadership of the Reich. In other words, Göring was like,
"You confirm that I am now the new leader, right?"
This wasn't symbolic. Göring had been Hitler's first second-in-command, head of the police, head of the Air Force, the man who had helped crush rivals when the Nazis first seized power. More importantly, Göring set a deadline, and he implied that if no response came, he would act. But when the telegram reached Berlin, Hitler was still alive, still issuing orders, still moving divisions that barely existed, and you can imagine how mad Hitler was. Within hours, Hitler stripped Göring of all offices, expelled him from the Nazi Party, and ordered his arrest. But just a day later, Heinrich Himmler did something particularly worse. Himmler was the head of the hardcore SS Waffen unit overseeing the Holocaust and human experiments. Himmler worshipped Hitler and without doubt was among the most loyal of Hitler's unbreakable inner circle. But in the final moments, behind Hitler's back, Himmler secretly authorized peace negotiations with the Western Allies, offering Germany surrender in the West while continuing war against the USSR. And this violated Hitler's explicit orders. We are unbreakable. So when the news got to Hitler just 4 days later, the Allies bragging about even how delicate Hitler's circle had become, Hitler called Himmler the worst traitor of all, ordered his arrest and execution. But Himmler escaped and disappeared from the radar. Hitler had just lost both the police and the SS Waffen to his side, and without the latter, Hitler believed everything was lost. The next day, Hitler dictated his final will and testament. He did not blame himself. He blamed Göring and Himmler, accusing them of having betrayed the nation. He named Joseph Goebbels as Chancellor and Karl Dönitz as President of the Reich. On 30 April 1945, just 10 days after Hitler marked his birthday underground, Stalin had turned Berlin into a scoreboard between his two generals. A race towards the bunker of Hitler, and Hitler had began to hear explosions echoing above the bunker, so Hitler shot himself. However, for the final card on the table, this is where belief became the most tragic among them all. One day later, in that same bunker, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children, believing the world after Hitler was not worth living in, especially for them. Days later, Karl Dönitz, now head of the collapsing Reich, authorized Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies. The war in Europe was over,